For the second panel, we have a witness who, at his request, has asked us not to use his actual name. So I'd ask that colleagues comply with his request. And without further ado,
I yield the floor to you. Thanks for being with us tonight at this late hour to share your perspective of this committee. It's much appreciated. And you have the floor for the next 5 minutes.
Honorable members of the committee, before I begin, I would like to clarify my intentions. I am not here to attack SDTC or its workers or the companies that it funds. SCTC plays a critical role in the Canadian economy. I genuinely believe in its mandate, and I can personally attest to how effective the organization is at utilizing taxpayer money to create jobs and develop new industries. The organization needs to survive, and the employees working there need to be protected, because empowering those SDTC employees is crucial for the successful delivery of its mandate. And the only way to get SDTC back on track is to discuss the facts and set the record straight. I believe that accountability is the cornerstone of a just society, and that's the sole purpose of my presence here. The SCTC board, executives, and senior management must be held accountable for their gross mismanagement of taxpayer money and the gross misconduct that's been perpetrated by the toxic senior management team that has victimized countless employees. And the federal government must also be held accountable for its embarrassing lack of oversight that's allowed these problems to persist and its egregious cover-up of the truth that occurred this fall. At the beginning of this year, a comprehensive 345-page presentation was created and submitted to the Privy Council office at the request of the Office of the Auditor General of Canada, who we originally went to. This package contained documents that outline gross mismanagement across every aspect of SDTC's operations and governance. It highlighted non-compliance with the SDTC Act and contribution agreement across all of the organization's funding streams, and serious breaches of the conflict of interest policies by the executives and board. The package also included evidence of the toxic workplace culture that was created by CEO Leah Lawrence and her friend and still current VP Zoe Kolbuck, who've been allowed to continue abusing and harassing employees by a passive senior management team and board that protects and hides the abuse. All of this information underwent review by PCO and was then forwarded to ISED, who subsequently engaged RCGT to conduct an independent fact-finding exercise to validate this information. Here are the findings for everyone. The Seed Fund, Ecosystem Fund, and Scale-Up Fund were all found to be ineligible due to multiple violations of the contribution agreement, significant deviations from the due diligence process, and conflict of interest breaches by board members and executives. This finding encompasses nearly 200 companies that all received over $80 million, all of which was improperly funded using taxpayer money. The two COVID payments in 2020 and 2021 were also given to the full portfolio of companies and totaled almost $40 million, and were also deemed to be ineligible as the use of these funds was not effectively tracked. And several board members in that instance also violated conflict of interest by approving almost $4 million to themselves to over a dozen companies where they all hold significant ownership or executive positions. The report also revealed that SDTC lacked HR processes or policies, and issues were never even reported to the board. And conveniently, the RCGT investigators couldn't even find a single record of any complaint ever being made in the history of the organization. This is a staggering level of incompetence, willful ignorance, and corruption that has resulted in SDTC improperly distributing almost $150 million in taxpayer dollars just in the past few years and abusing dozens of people that have only tried to talk about the truth. The organization deserved to be suspended. The organization also deserved a new board, executive, and senior management team, but that never happened. Not a single one of the individuals responsible for these issues has faced a single consequence. No executive or board member was terminated or even given the slightest handcuffs. And every single person that was directly implicated even had their names redacted and protected by ISED in the RCGT report. Even more shocking is the fact that despite these findings, ISED continues to allow these individuals to manage taxpayer dollars and allows them to continue perpetuating the abuse against employees who've been desperately seeking protection from their own government for over a year. That cannot stand. SDTC's board and executive continues to insist that the issues are just minor inconsistencies, while ISED and the minister continue to claim that no findings warrant serious action. These are false narratives, and I'm here to provide documented proof of all of the lies that continue to be perpetuated by both SDTC and ISED. I believe that my testimony can provide an in-depth overview of the key issues at SDTC because I worked on the financial due diligence and compliance of projects at SDTC for the key 2-year period that coincides with the most serious findings in the RCGT report. I am also intimately aware of exactly how ISED understood the issues and the clear direction that the total bureaucracy had laid out. The minister and PCO have been aware of this file for more than they are telling to the public, and there are even documented evidence that they even engaged with everyone at ISED to make sure there were edits to the briefings before they were officially sent to them. All of this is backed up by documents, transcripts, and recordings, some of which we've already submitted to this committee. Thank you, and I welcome all your questions.
Thank you very much, sir. And to start the discussion, I'll turn to MP Barrett.
Sir, I have 6 minutes, and so I'll ask you a question, and I'll give you up to a minute to respond to each. So I'll try and do this in 6 questions if I can. Can you confirm that in your opening statement that you've said that up to 150 million taxpayer dollars have been misappropriated in your estimation?
Correct.
How many board members and executives are in conflicts of interest and are funding companies that they have a financial interest in?
At least half of them.
Are you able to provide some examples to the committee?
I think key examples would include ex-CEO and ex-chair Annette Verschuren and Leah Lawrence. I think what they've said before is not the full truth because Annette Verschuren said that she had never applied for anything at SDTC, but she in fact applied to SDTC for her Verschuren Center in 2021 and tried to get funding for that organization, which was ultimately rejected.
Sir, you mentioned that you have documented proof of the things that you've said. Is there any information that you have not submitted to the committee that you would be able to provide to the committee specifically with respect to your testimony today?
We are willing to provide all the information under the condition that it's also publicly released.
Okay, so you'll be able to forward that to the clerk?
Yeah.
The conflicts of interest that we've seen that have been identified as with respect to appointees of the Liberal government that have totaled more than $600,000 with respect to, specifically with respect to COVID payments with Ms. Verschuren and Mr. Ouimet. These are not isolated incidents with respect to those COVID payments. Is that correct?
That's correct. When we're talking about the COVID payments, what we need to talk about is that there were 2 payments that were made. And the findings of the RCGT report don't just say that the conflict of interest rules were broken. What they've also found is that all of the $40 million that was given out was not even effectively tracked because anything that's funded by SCTC has to be tracked for eligible funding, and none of that happened for both payments, which was founded by the RCGT report.
Well, how much money flowed to the companies that are in conflict of interest?
For both of those payments, it would be almost $2 million each time to likely a dozen companies or more. It's hard for us to really know because we were not really made aware of all the conflicts of the board members at most of the time.
So you just heard testimony from ISED officials, the deputy minister. To your knowledge, in their opening statement or in response to questions from members of this committee, did they mislead or fail to provide fulsome answers?
They did.
Can you provide the details of that assessment?
So, with regards to the ISED situation, ISED representatives were open and transparent about the investigation from day one and provided weekly debriefs on the progress. There was no coercion in any of this. And here are the real facts of the matter. ISED representatives have spoken multiple occasions that there were no briefings made to PCO regarding the situation. This is a lie because we have evidence that the deputy minister and ADM were in continuous conversations with PCO because the investigation included GIC appointees. The minister has spoken on the record multiple times that he was only briefed on the outcome on August 27th, but that's definitively not true, and he has lied at the Ethics Committee. The deputy minister spoke to the minister's office and the minister on several occasions before the briefings were finalized, including edits that were made on behalf of the minister's office. The real truth of the matter is there was a definitive consensus across the bureaucracy at both ISED and PCO, and the full board and executive team at SDTC needed to be terminated. This was described to us in detail and on multiple occasions in late August and September. The outcome of this situation only changed when the minister's office became involved, and he is ultimately responsible for SDTC, and he's the one that needs to tell the truth about what the real situation is. With regards to some of this, we have already submitted clips and transcripts from September 1st and September 29th that provide all of the detailed information, and if I have some time, I'd like to just go over some of that.
Okay, I've got 60 seconds
That's
left,
enough.
so go ahead, sir.
On August 25th, this is what was said. The overall thematic is kind of where we've come to sort of understand as well, which is that there's a lot of sloppiness and laziness, and there's some outright incompetence, and the situation is untenable at this point, and that doesn't even include any of the allegations related to the way in which the place is managed. Just on the basis of the administration of the agreement, the governance, the conflict of interest, and shoddy management of the COI, the situation is untenable. On September 1st, the report implicates the board in terrible ways by not following process, not following COI regime, and not being prudent fiduciaries. They've missed out on so many issues. It's a board failure altogether, and this is how we're briefing it. This is how it's well understood by us and the deputies, and I think it's understood by PCO as well because it's not the first time they've seen this kind of situation. And the final one is in September 29th. Since we've last spoke, most of the week for us has been involved in finalizing the briefing to the minister. Obviously, there's been verbal debriefs from the minister to the chief of staff and the minister himself, just so he gets a heads up on what's coming, and that's resulted in tweaking to the briefing packages and all that stuff.
Thank you very much. MP Sorbara, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair, and welcome, sir, to the committee this evening. As someone who came from the private sector before entering public service, obviously very important, and we're having worked in large organizations, dealing with human resources and in the structure in the organization, having the ability to deal with human resources is very important to raise concerns on a spectrum of reasons, from everything from how you're being treated as an individual, as an employee, to the internal processes as an organization, and so forth, in terms of how financial matters are being handled. Obviously, you raised certain concerns and so forth. My question is, first of all, in terms of the internal process at SDTC that you were able to follow or able to pursue, can you speak about that? How the issues were handled internally, when how you raised them, and what was the reception, and so forth?
Is this related to HR complaints or related to the funding?
Both tangents, if you may.
Yeah. With regards to HR policies, it's not just that there was massive turnover at the employee level. Within a 2-year period, every single HR director, which is almost 4, were either fired or they went on stress leave. So even when complaints were being made, the employees that were then tasked with dealing with them, if they actually took it seriously, every single one of them would be pushed out or fired. And every single one of them was put under an NDA, which specifically had language that prevented them from even going to the federal government to complain about the issues that were ongoing. So as it relates to the organization as a whole, the culture of fear is there and it's existed for a long time. And even when people have the strength and courage to take those issues to someone, every single time it's been hammered down because of people like Leah Lawrence, Zoe Kalbach, and the whole organization as the top senior level management. With regards to the funding issues, all of the issues that were found by RCGT were noted by employees on multiple occasions. There are emails we can provide where we and others also had issues that were sent to executives and even to the CEO. An example of that would be the Verschuren Center application, and that's related to the ecosystem fund. So the ecosystem fund, which has been found by RCGT to not be in any way eligible, was approved by the board without any consultation with ISED. And when it was approved by the board themselves, the first project, the second project, and the third project, all of them were related to board members and had conflicts. The second one specifically was the Verschuren Center application, and employees complained multiple times, even on email, to executives complaining that this is an obvious conflict of interest, yet not a single one of those issues was heard by executives, and we were continually ignored up until it went to the board, and other board members finally admitted that this was an obvious conflict of interest. And even after it was rejected, the executives then forced employees to use SDTC's reputation to personally go to other federal or provincial funding organizations at which they could then use SDTC's reputation and see whether they would be willing to give the Verschuren Center funding. So even when something doesn't get approved, there's still employee pressure from the executive team to make sure some of these things happen.
Just for not for clarification, but just to put it on the record, when you mentioned the word NDAs, you were talking about non-disclosure agreements.
Correct.
Okay. Do I have any further time? Okay. And my second question is, you did obviously, it sounds like yourself and many other folks did raise issues. When would you say, or how long would you say it took for either the board members or for internal processes to kick in where these concerns were listened to or heard and accepted that they were serious from your point of view?
They were never taken seriously, and they were always swept under the rug.
Okay. My final question is in terms of the actual functioning of SDTC, in terms of the, in Canada we have a tech ecosystem. Our levels of capital are robust, but say not as robust as south of the border, with many investors that are there and private equity funds and so forth that exist in the United States. So SDTC, in my view, fulfills a specific role and a very important one. Would you concur that that is the intent of SDTC, is to fulfill that role in investing on a grant, non-repayable grant basis in companies in Canada that are clean tech, have potentially a very bright future, can turn into larger entities and create a whole ecosystem themselves?
How much time do we have to respond? 40 seconds. I do agree with that. The issues that we're talking about here aren't related to that mandate, because I agree, the grants themselves are not a problem, and the companies, the majority of them deserve it. One of the issues that we're talking about here in the RCGT report was also related to the scale-up fund, where on average, SDTC provides $2 to $3 million to companies, but within the scale-up, it's almost $20 million per company. And for those companies, these are companies that are fully commercial. They have major investments in the hundreds of millions of dollars, and they're big enough that they're buying up other companies. And yet, because they're connected to different executives or board members, they're getting that funding.
If I can interject, I only have about, say, 10, 15 seconds left. Is there a timeline that you have, because when you were there for 2 years, I believe, or from what it sounds like?
Mr. Sorbar, I'm afraid you're out of time, so we'll leave it here. Je vais passer la parole à Monsieur Le.
Floor is yours, Mr. Lemire. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairperson. First, I'd like to know What motivated you to come and testify here before us today?
Accountability.
And could you tell us to what extent or how it is that you're a credible witness? Why should we believe your testimony and evidence here today?
Because I'm not a disgruntled employee. I left SDTC on my own accord, and I'm one of the rare few employees that wasn't fired or given an NDA. So I can also provide evidence and documentation that even when I provided my resignation, I was offered a promotion and more money to stay at SDTC because throughout the 2 years I was there, I was a high performer. I received all of that in writing, and I can also provide it. So I also worked on every single one of these funds, whether it's the seed fund, ecosystem fund, scale fund, or the regular tech fund. So being on the financial side, I got to see every single aspect of these projects, and more importantly, it's on the financial compliance because we know exactly what the rules are because we are dealing with the rules here, and we could see where the deviations are, whether they're slight or major. So that's why I believe I'm a credible witness, because as an employee, I'm not a disgruntled employee like SDTC continues to state around other people, and I'm not under an NDA, so I chose to come here out of my own choice with taking all of those risks.
Dans vos remarques préliminaires.
In your opening remarks and in the responses that you've given thus far, you often have used the expression we. Who does that we amount to?
That includes current and former employees. This would be, between 20 and 30, both half on the inside and on the outside. Because, again, the majority of ex-employees, none of which were ever fired for cause, every single one of them was given a package and the stipulation that for you to receive the package you have to sign these NDAs. On the inside, you can clearly see that there's a major culture of fear that still persists because just because the CEO is gone, that doesn't mean that all of her friends that she's hired in the executive seats, like Zoe Klobach or Stephen Engel, or all of the other passive bystanders that continue to perpetuate these issues, all of them still exist. So it's very hard to have a lot of people willing to come to these situations.
Based on an article from Radio-Canada 1st of November, there's a whistleblower that expressed the feeling that the government made a number of unkept promises and tried to minimize the ramifications of your complaint. So could you please further elaborate on what those unkept promises this article refers to are?
I think the most major one has to be the protection of employees. The minister stated that as soon as this report was completed, they started this HR investigation. That's a lie. Since day one, we made sure that the HR issues were noted because that's the most important aspect of the investigation. How can you properly investigate when employees aren't being protected on the inside? So they've known about the culture issues from day one, and those were proven to them even in May. Now, the most egregious thing that happened during ISED's investigation has to be that in September, while they were still investigating, another employee was fired by Leah Lawrence, and then nothing was done to protect this employee. And this is during the ISED investigation, and ISED was unwilling to stand up and stop this. This employee was put under the same sort of NDA that every other employee has had to deal with. So ISED knew about this, and they were unwilling to do anything to protect employees, just like they're doing now, because even the McCarthy-Tetro investigation that they've started has already broken confidentiality because every single person that signs up for it, all of their names are shown to SDTC executives, and they can list off everyone that's taking this. So the whole HR investigation has been a farce. On the other side, what we asked was not for everyone to be fired. We asked for proper investigation, and when all of this was founded in May, it was then suddenly changed. The continued changing of the goalposts happened throughout this investigation, and the key issue is that because no one was protected, this has continued to lapse.
Dernière petite question.
Final quick question. How do you assess the efficiency of the whistleblower's program and mechanisms that were put in place? Does the mechanism need to be tweaked in any way? And as a subtext here, I would say there's also a lack of trust and confidence. How would one best restore the lack of confidence between the government and stakeholders?
Well, with regards to our experience in the whole situation, I think it's frankly embarrassing. And the whole whistleblowing process basically proves to us that there is a two-tier system that exists. If you are a normal, regular Canadian citizen and you go to your government to complain that, hey, there is wrongdoing happening where you risk your career and your professional reputation, they don't even do anything about it. You know, this whole farce that we were disgruntled and there was some sort of coercion with all of this happening, none of that's actually true because we were patient. How does a fact-finding take 7 months? That's factually incorrect, and they know it because that turned into an investigation by June, and they continue to do it. And what I find disgusting about this is that they continue to deny even the most basic level of truth. When you talk about whistleblowing, they never protected anyone, so everyone that went to ISED as it relates to this, the thing that they were definitive about was you are not going to be protected from the federal government if anything happens from the backlash that the SDTC executives or board members would have to these employees.
Merci beaucoup.
Merci, Monsieur McGregor.
Mr. McGregor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thank you for being here today, sir. You know, before I got into elected office, I've worked for a few different companies, and I've seen different managerial culture, and certainly it falls on a great spectrum. And at times, you know, poor management can be a result of the individuals that are there. At other times, it can be a result because the general culture or ecosystem is poor. So if you don't have strong processes in place, it can allow bad people to do bad things. Whereas if you have good processes in place, at least you can ensure that those people are following the rules. Now, I did note in your opening statement, you have talked about the great work that SDTC has done. You do think it's a valuable enterprise, and that you know, with some changes, it should be able to continue doing that great work. But when you were talking about the toxic work culture that exists there, I was just wondering, could you go into a little bit more detail on that? Like, I'm trying to understand, was that a result of the fact that there were bad people there, or was it bad processes, or was it bad people and bad processes that allowed this to fester?
It's both.
Yeah.
And the reason for that is the bad people don't let the processes come into existence. So, you know, several of the HR people that were all subsequently fired tried to bring in processes. What happens at SDTC, which was, again, founded in the RCGT report that no processes exist, they used to exist. Everything has gone downhill since Leah Lawrence started. It was a slow burn, but that's what happened. And when I talk about this, you know, it's sort of like you get rid of all of the executives one by one. Then you start hiring personal friends in those executive positions. Then those personal friends start hiring other personal friends into all of these different organizations and all of these different parts of that organization. So it's taken a long time to get to the point that we're at, but this is where it's gotten to because there's never been any accountability for anyone at SDTC, because even at the board level, you know, one of the things I want to point out in terms of the gross level of corruption and governance issues that exist, you know, Simon Kennedy came here and talked about how at the board level, only 7 out of the 15 appointees are GIC. The other 8, which a lot of them are on the HR committees of SDTC, they are appointed by what's called a member committee or a member council, which is also the SDTC Act that says that the public interest is represented by these member committees, which are a group of 15 people that are the ones that appoint the other 8, which is the majority of the board. For the last 4 or 5 years, that committee is down to only 2 people, one of which is SDTC's own internal lawyer, Ed Vandenberg. So for the last 5 years, 2 people have been appointing the majority of the board through a basically illegal process. So it's not just that, you know, there's governance issues at the bottom, it's also at the top, and the people that are being brought in even at the board are personal friends of the CEO and other people, because no one is doing a single level of oversight across this. And again, even this issue was brought up to ISED, and they've understood it, but they've chosen not to act, even though legitimately this is someone or a group of people that are breaking the law, because how is it that you're allowing people who've illegally been appointed to the board of SCTC who are then making decisions on taxpayer dollars in the millions every single day? It's across the board.
Yeah, thank you for that detail. One of the other things, like I'm here replacing my colleague, Mr. Massey, and you touched on this with another question, but just like on protection for employees, making sure that we have the protection of law and a safe space for people to come forward like this. Can you offer any more comments for this committee of what our possible recommendations on that should be?
There's a lot of recommendations. I think the main one has to be that the federal government needs to provide an output for all of these employees to go into the federal service.
Okay.
That is the key thing that needs to happen, because even to this day, with this investigation that's happening on the HR side, there are people that have been abused for so long that it's almost impossible for them to trust the situation, especially when you consider how ISED has botched this right at the end. All of the trust that existed is completely gone. So even with this McCarthy-Tetro investigation, no one really believes it's going to go anywhere, but that's the only choice everyone has. They're going to try to see if it goes anywhere, but what needs to really happen is what Brian Massey said. The federal government needs to provide employees the opportunity to leave SDTC, go somewhere else, and that's where they can then provide all of the testimony that's required. Mm-hmm. That's the only way you can actually move forward, is because no one feels safe even to this day, because I said bureaucracy and the minister are unwilling to let them have that safety. The government is the ultimate power in this situation. SDTC is funded by taxpayer dollars 100% from ISED. Mm-hmm. How can they say that they had no control over HR? How can they say that they don't have the ability to protect employees? Mm-hmm. This is insanity.
Is that it, Mr. Chair?
Oui, merci beaucoup. Je passerai maintenant la parole.
Yes, Mr. Perkins, the floor is yours now. 5 minutes.
I want to get into some very specific things. In your testimony, your opening, you said you worked on the financial analysis of proposals, grant proposals through all of the funds. And you had mentioned the Annette Fisherian Center, which is in Nova Scotia, Annette Fisherian being the chair of this board. You said that Annette Fisherian and the Fisherian Center applied for funds, I think it is, from the Ecosystem Fund. Is that correct?
Correct.
And that application, you were involved with some of your colleagues in analyzing it? Yeah. The Ecosystem Fund doesn't support directly green technology companies, does it?
No, SCTC's mandate is to directly fund clean technologies versus what the Ecosystem Fund has been designated by the board is to fund indirectly companies or organizations that help clean technology companies.
And the Fisherian Center in Cape Breton, Nova Scotia, is not a clean tech company, is that correct?
No, it's not.
Okay. So what year did that application or process happen?
The application was initiated sometime in the summer of 2021. And what I want to point out as it relates to that application is the Ecosystem Fund is not a publicly available fund. SDTC needs, as part of their contribution agreement, you have to provide everyone the equal opportunity to apply to funding agreements and to apply to any of these funds. For the Ecosystem Fund, that never existed, so it was brought to us by the executives to say, we are now looking at the Fisherian Center.
Did you have any concerns, or did any of the employees have any concerns that funding a center, an ego project of the chair might be a conflict?
There were emails that were sent and by multiple employees.
Who were they sent to?
Executives at SCTC.
Do you have copies of those?
I do.
Would you table those with the committee?
I do.
Thank you. And so when you went through the analysis, What was the state of the Annette Basharian Center at Cape Breton University at the time, financially?
It would likely go bankrupt if it didn't receive federal funding.
And how much was the chair seeking for her EGO project from the Green Slush Fund?
$2.2 million.
Wow, 2.2 million. And so when that process was the chair ever inquiring as to the state of the process and how it was going?
Yes, she indirectly emailed the executives or other parts of the organization to check in on the progress of the application.
So she was directly involved in trying to push it forward with management.
Absolutely.
And what was the conclusion that the analysis from the team that went to the board said about whether or not it should be funded?
It was recommended for funding.
It was. Why was it recommended for funding?
Because that's how the organization works. The level of due diligence at SDTC is extremely high, but the ultimate authority on whether projects move forward to the project review committee is held by executives.
So the approving body ultimately is the board itself. Is that right?
The ultimate approving body, but before it goes to the board, it has to go to the project review committee. But before it goes to the project review committee, it has to be agreed upon by the executives.
Okay, so the project review committee reviewed this?
And rejected it based on the conflict of interest, but they still were in favor of it for its technical.
So when it was rejected, were there any commitments that were made to the board chair as to what employees would do after that rejection?
Yeah, they're all included in the board minutes of the project review committee meeting, where it was clearly stated that SDTC employees would help the Verscharen Center and move that application into other sources of funding.
So can you table those minutes with the committee?
Yes.
So let me get this straight. The project review committee employees were told after SDTC rejected Annette Basharian's $2.2 million request to fund her own center, then employees were told that you had to go to work to help Annette Basharian find that money somewhere else in the government?
Using SDTC's reputation. And just for everyone's reference, SDTC rejects applications all the time, and it references other organizations if they're not a fit. There's an unprecedented time here where employees were asked to go and use that SDTC reputation to go to other places.
And did they do that?
They did.
And
Sorry, Mr. Perkins, you're out of time. Je vais passer maintenant la parole à Madame Lapointe pour...
Ms. Lapointe, 5 minutes.
Thank you for coming here this evening, and I see that you also took time to prepare your 5-minute statement, and so I want to thank you for that time that you put into that. I think it's important for this committee to hear from you. And in that opening statement, and I want to make sure that I have been able to understand in a very accurate way the information you were giving us, and so can you clarify the timeline chronologically, that in a chronological order, because there were so many dates there. I want to make sure that I've captured it.
With relation to the complaint?
The overview of the timelines of events related to the concerns that you've raised.
So in terms of all the issues, they've been on at the organization, they've been ongoing for years. So that could even go back to like 2017 or before. As it relates to the issues at hand and how the complaints move forward, it was initially brought to the Office of the Auditor General in December of last year. And after they reviewed the information, they had asked that the information be sent to PCO, and that's where all of the information was then packaged into the 345-slide presentation, which, again, it included all of the documents and all of the references to make sure that it was comprehensive so that it wasn't just allegations. And after that, PCO passed it off to ISED, and then ISED initiated the fact-finding in March. In May, what was told to everyone was that the findings had been found. So every single issue that ISED has noted to suspend SDTC in October was founded all the way back in May. So they've been sitting on this for over 4 months between that time, and this is where the minister's office initially got involved, because once it was mentioned to them, they had provided us some of the indication of, this is all of the subsequent investigations. But again, at that point, it was a fact-finding exercise. So the whole outcome of that was a 6-week review, which would, if anything was proven, it would then initiate the required investigations for it, which would be a due process investigation involving the Office of the Auditor General, reviewing all the HR issues, and also a review by ISED because there were major issues that they found in the compliance agreement on the contribution side. So all of that was what they had said was founded and that they had planned to initiate the investigation. Once it got to June, after they initiated some of those conversations with the minister's office, it was suddenly said that they need more time to fact check. And ISED.
ISED.
Senior ISED executives.
Okay.
And so when I mention ISED, it's always senior ISED executives. So in June, they then said that this is now a smaller level investigation. So they even stated to us that this was not a fact-finding exercise anymore. This is an investigation, and we can provide details to prove that point.
So when they stated that to all employees, or?
No, not to employees, because again, none of the information as it pertains to the investigation was ever directly given to SDTC employees, even though ISED asked SDTC to provide those updates. The SDTC executives continually withheld information regarding the progress of the investigation and even the initiation of the investigation for employees until the media started reporting on it. Going back to that timeline, once it got to June, what was then, like June and July, what was then said was they had found that they could not even trust SDTC executives with the documents because what RCGT and ISED were finding were documents were being changed. And there was a level of mistrust within ISED on what SDTC was even sharing with them. And that's where in July they asked us to provide additional documents that they were not being able to get from SDTC. Now, in August is when everything changed because that request was then canceled, and then they said they are going to fire all the executives and board members. So it was ISED that began the conversations around how they're going to fire everyone, and then by October, it was when they then suddenly said, we aren't going to do any of that.
And so let me understand. So when you were bringing concerns forward, were you doing that through HR, or were you doing that through the next level up?
Sorry,
in
ISED?
bringing concerns forward.
Sorry, I don't work at SCTC anymore, and the whole situation at ISED was an indirect, there was no legitimate system in terms of because SDTC is outside the purview, right, as they've stated, there isn't even a process that exists to take these complaints in, which is why it went from the Office of the Auditor General to PCO and then to ISED, because they had to figure out who dealt with it.
Okay. So did you have
thank you,
direct
Madame,
interactions with ISED?
Madame Lapointe, I'm sorry. Monsieur Lemire, la parole est à vous pour 2 minutes 30.
Mr. Lemire, 2.5 minutes. Thank you very much again for being in attendance this evening. Now, last week, Mr. Kavucha said that the internal investigatory process had been upheld and that he'd invested heavily in the process, and he said that a complaint had been processed. Are you the individual that lodged the complaint with this gentleman, just out of curiosity? No?
Information around that situation.
Est-ce que, donc,
Well, what light can you shed on this in that case?
The Osler process is something that ISED themselves were told about when the initial investigation started by ISED. So a complaint was made to the board member, Stephen Kakucha, at the end of January. Now, he stated that they had asked for information from the whistleblowers, which were internal employees, and that they never received anything. The reason for that, and we are willing to provide all of the emails between that situation, what happened was they picked Osler, which is a clearly conflicted law firm that has been used consistently by SDTC to put people under NDAs. Now, some of the most significant complaints that were involved required NDAs be waived because how can you truly investigate a situation if the people that are pertinent to it are not even being interviewed? Now, the back and forth that happened between the employees and Osler, once it was decided that Osler was going to investigate, they had mentioned that they were going to use the SDTC ethics policy as the guiding framework through which the investigation was going to happen. But when the employees mentioned that the same policy requires disclosure and transparency around what the investigation is and what the outcomes are going to be, Osler immediately reneged on that, and they then suddenly said that this is actually not under the ethics policy, which they themselves said to the employees was in place. So once that happened, it was clear that this was a cover-up, and when ICED started their investigation in March all the way to now, they've consistently had that same view of it, where this whole situation on SDTC using Osler is clearly made to divert attention and hide the actual truth. So I know that Osler also provided, investigation outcomes, but none of those investigations and issues were even investigated correctly. So what he says is completely false, and again, we are willing to provide all those documents because they are unwilling to even tell ICED about that, but ICED knew about all of those emails back and forth.
Merci, Monsieur le Maire.
Merci.
Monsieur McGregor.
Mr. Lemire, thank you. Mr. McGregor.
Thank you, Chair. A lot of the focus that I've seen so far in this meeting has been about, what is the executive branch of government going to be doing? So, in other words, like we've just had the Deputy Minister and his assistants here talking about, what they're going to do internally, but that's all in the executive branch. And I want to focus my question more on, like, what can the legislative branch do? I think you're seeing part of that in action right now through a parliamentary committee investigating this issue, issuing a report with recommendations. But, you've been detailing all of the problems as you've experienced them, and you are in touch with other employees. But just looking at the legislative authorization that SDTC gets through the Canada Foundation for Sustainable Development Technology Act, say that quickly 5 times. Do you think that there is another role for the legislative branch in looking at stronger legislative guardrails? Have you ever thought about that part of the question, and would you have any recommendations for this committee to look at?
Yeah, like when we're talking about the SCTC Act or that legislation, one of the issues that we found is it seems like no one is actually keeping organizations in compliance as it relates to that. So the Act exists, and when I'm mentioning these member committee people that are illegally being appointed to the board, we still don't know who has authority over overseeing that issue, and it's still not being addressed, even though that's a serious issue of governance at SDTC. Now, there are obvious rules that already exist for, let's say, board members. I can read off anything within the federal government's ethics policy where what they say is governing council appointees are required to perform their duties in the public interest. Their personal and professional conduct must be beyond reproach. I don't think anyone here can actually say that the conduct that's been done by the SDTC board is beyond reproach. And on top of that, there's also other language within that agreement that says public office holders have an obligation to perform their official duties and arrange their private affairs in a manner that will bear the closest public scrutiny, an obligation that is not fully discharged by simply acting within the law. And that's the other thing. A lot of the board members and executives come here and say they've done everything right because they talk to their own lawyer. That's not good enough when this is taxpayer dollars, and there's clear language across multiple acts, across multiple policies the federal government has that clearly show that everything that's done up to now by the executives and board members doesn't even meet that minimum threshold. So I think the issue is, even if there's more language that exists, who's going to actually enforce this?
Enforce it, yeah.
There's no enforcement in any of this. Had ICED actually enforced their contribution agreement, none of this would have ever happened. So that's where their issue is, where you can have as many agreements that exist, but if no one's enforcing anything and no one's overseeing the actual day-to-day functions, they even had a non-observer board person, but it's obvious that he was clearly incompetent and didn't understand what was going on.
Okay, thank you.
Monsieur Barrett.
Sir, I have 5 minutes. I'm going to split my time with Mr. Perkins, so I'll try and get through these questions quickly with your help if I can. Is there missing context related to the bonuses and the COVID payments that you can provide us with?
Yes. think one of the things that the committee needs to understand about the COVID payments isn't just that there were conflict of interest rules that were broken. Both of these payments were done within days of the end of fiscal year 2020 and 2021. And in both times, the amount of money that was sent out made a significant impact on the bonuses that executives get. So when on one side, board members are getting all of their companies and all of the information, they're getting all of this funding on one side, and by approving this funding where they've broken conflict of interest rules, they're then also giving bonuses to all of the executives that were the ones that presented that information to the board members.
Okay.
On top of that, the other issue is, for the second COVID payment, it's not just that it was a COVID situation. By 2021, SDTC's board in the fall of 2020 had already agreed that they were not going to do any blanket payments like they had already done. That was in the board presentation, which we can again table, and SDTC even did a full survey of the total portfolio of SDTC companies, which showed that on average, every single company had over 14 months of runway, which is more than enough that you don't need any funding. And instead, the board was presented with another COVID payment, where they then agreed to. And in this case, the board members are coming here saying that the companies were desperate, they needed it, and it was a requirement. That's absolutely false. The companies didn't need it, and the executives chose to give it to everyone.
I have 30 seconds remaining before I turn my time over. The minister said he continuously received evidence. Is that correct?
He did.
And was Simon Kennedy aware of the plan outlined by Mr. McConaughey in May, and was he at those briefings?
He was, and he spoke to him directly on multiple occasions in May and June.
And is that contrary to the testimony that he gave today?
It is.
Okay, I'll turn it over to Mr. Perkins.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you. Thank you. Question up front. Will you table, it'll be public on the website as evidence, the 30 hours of tapes that you did with the CFO, I said, as well as the pertinent documents?
We will table all the information required.
I'd like to explore one thing on the COVID payments. You said that they weren't all supposed to get the same amount, which is the excuse that's used for voting themselves $3.7 million over 2 meetings. Why was that? Why wouldn't they give them to everybody?
I can't say for certain because I don't know how the executives thought about it, but what happened in that second COVID payment isn't just that everyone got 5%. There was a secondary decision made where certain companies that were the most financially successful were suddenly given 10%. So what they continue to state is that the second COVID payment was, again, made as it pertains to companies and the whole portfolio of SCTC that was having issues with financing and issues with COVID. But what actually was happening was they had information that clearly showed companies had long enough runways that no financing was required, and yet they then created a new criteria that gave them an additional 10% instead of the 5% that everyone had, which included board member companies.
Companies like MindSense, which Andre Lees Matteau has a financial interest in, that got 10%.
Correct.
So did you and did the team do an analysis of these companies of whether or not they actually needed any COVID relief cash?
There was analysis done on both the funding requirements, but even more, there was also analysis done, which the executives wanted employees to do, which was related to the contribution agreement, because by this point, there were enough federal programs that existed that companies were actually being overfunded to the point where they were breaking the eligibility of what their funding requirements are.
So as an example, MindSense, which got 10% bump up, at the time of the analysis, I think had 100 months of cash available, so they didn't actually need any cash to get through COVID.
They didn't.
And there are other companies like that as well that directors have a financial interest in, that have excess cash but still yet got cash?
Correct.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Are we done?
We have one last round with MP Gahir for 5 minutes.
Great. Thank you, Chair. My question to the witness, my first question at least, and if the witness can answer this very succinctly because the time is obviously limited. If an organization seeks to get funding, can you just quickly walk us through that process of seeking that funding to approval, of what the steps are? Just very quickly.
funding, you can submit or reach out through SDTC's website. We have SDTC has a continuous intake function where you can apply in, and then there's a structured process that reviews the application on multiple lines of inquiry before it then officially takes it into a full due diligence. So the full process from application to potential approval is several months at minimum.
And the due diligence step, could you just walk us through what that involves?
So there's different due diligences depending on the fund, and that's one of the findings of the RCGT board. The regular and required due diligence process has governance functions in it. So once a project is taken into full due diligence, it provides hundreds of documents related to its financials, its technicals, and all of that is reviewed by multiple employees, and you also have to get external third-party experts on the business and technical side, all of whom then have to provide a recommendation, which is what's used to take the company to the board. Now, within the ecosystem fund and seed fund, none of that happens, and that's one of the findings which has shown that all of this process has been completely deviated because we're not even following the most basic level of due diligence for certain funds.
So once the board grants the approval, is that it, or is there more steps after that?
Approval happens, you still have to review financials and other details, structure it into a contract, and once the contract is structured, then you sign it, and then after that, there's oversight year over year for the funding. So it can be anywhere from 3 to 5 years, and there's a minimum requirement of reporting every 12 months where you then have to re-review the progress before you provide the next tranche of funding.
So before a project gets approval from the board itself, that step, if there's a conflict of interest, what happens then? What's the process there?
It depends on how the board decides, or that's what the process was. So up until the findings, how it worked was if there's a direct conflict, then a board member would recuse themselves. But again, employees were not aware of these conflicts until the end, versus if it's a perceived conflict, then board members would decide themselves on whether it was or wasn't. Now, the key thing to understand here is even if a conflict of interest exists, what the other findings in RCGT show is that every single project for the last several years has been unanimously approved with zero dissent. So even if you're leaving the room, and even if you're not reviewing it and you've not involved any of your opinion, it doesn't matter, because once it gets to the project review committee and board, every single project ultimately gets approved. Because again, it's not just that they're breaking conflict of interest, there's actually proof that they do not review and have zero oversight over some of the funding that they've provided.
So it seems to me that during this entire process of an organization seeking funding, getting funding approval, the oversight that happens after they get that approval, that ISET is not really involved in any one of these steps. It seems like it's concentrated really at the board.
Approval, but ISET's not involved in any of this, because ISET, even the non-official, they have no authority at the board level.
Okay. I think I'm out of time. Thank you, Chair.
Actually, you still had a minute, but I'll just...
Oh, please.
I'll just... Mr. Perkins wants it. I just have a question. Just, would you mind telling us, sir, for how long you worked at SDTC, if I understood correctly, for 2 years? So what years?
2021, 2022. So across those 3 years.
Okay, and just one thing, you mentioned in your testimony that most former employees of SDTC were under an NDA, but you are not. Is there a reason why you're not?
I wasn't fired.
You weren't fired. So only those who are fired are under an NDA, and those who just decided not to continue with SDTC are not under an NDA. And last question, I know it was asked, I think, by Mr. Lemire, but many times in your testimony you said we. Can you explain to me what was the we,
That's just a representation of the information. Again, I'm representing the larger group of people that are part of this complaint, because it's current employees and former employees. So that's where the we is coming from. So that's what I mean by that.
Okay.
Because certain issues aren't directly connected to me.
I get it. Thank you very much. Those were my very simple questions, sir. That's all the time we had. Thank you, colleagues, for a well-run meeting. Dans les temps, dans les budgets.
On time, And as planned, thank you, gentlemen, and colleagues. We'll see each other again tomorrow.